Greetings everyone, my name is Tara LaRose and I am providing you with this video lecture which covers Chapter 10 in the Hick textbook in the Intro to Social Welfare course. In this chapter, which focuses on social welfare and immigrants, we're going to be talking about things like multiculturalism, which is an important Canadian policy that shapes our understanding of our relationship to newcomer communities, immigrant communities, racialized communities, ethnic communities, religious communities, and so on. And we are going to be talking about things like race, racism, and racialization, and their relationship between income security and experiences of poverty. We're going to begin this lecture by talking about definitions, and we're going to consider what Hick describes as three key concepts: race, ethnicity, and culture. The first concept that we're going to look at, race, is a concept that is quite controversial, as Hick points out to us. Some people consider race to be the physical characteristics that are reflected in someone who's understood to belong to a particular racial community or racialized community. Race is understood to be in existence within the physical body. But many people believe this idea of race is something that is simply socially constructed, that our understandings or interpretations of the physical body are imbued with particular sets of understandings, particular values and beliefs, particular biases or myths that have in some ways been perpetrated or maybe justified by historical scientific experiments that have since been proven to be untrue or unfounded. So you'll see online that I've included some videos that support this idea of race as a socially constructed phenomena. And they complicate the idea of race as something that can be understood as relating to genetic makeup or particular physical characteristics. And I hope that you'll have a look at these to familiarize yourself with some of the alternative understandings of race and some of the debates that exist in relationship to this idea of the concept of race. Ethnicity is the next concept that we'll be talking about. And so ethnicity emphasizes the idea of common or shared descent or language, religion, or traditions, as Hick points out. But even within the idea of common descent, there can be complications or difficulties in really making this claim. So, for example, we might talk about a particular ethnic group, but we know that within that ethnic group there may be differences in language, differences in religion, or in particular interpretations of elements of language and religion, and in the traditions practiced. But ethnicity does give us some tools for talking about some elements of shared understanding or shared commonality. But as people who might be practicing in the social welfare system, it's a concept that we have to understand as something that we have to problematize. We have to challenge ourselves to think about how it is that we might misinterpret some information provided to us because we assume it relates to someone's ethnicity. Culture is a slightly more abstract concept in that it talks about the idea of ideals, norms, beliefs, values, and practices that may change over time. So some people may identify it as having a shared culture on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of religion, or on the basis of some other construct. So for example, on the basis of sexual orientation, people may talk about queer culture or lesbian culture, for example. People who identify as having a shared class identity might talk about working class culture. So culture is really the idea of practicing a particular set of beliefs, norms, values, understandings, and that this may change over time as a person's identity changes or how the way in which a particular group of people identifies themselves changes over time as well. I've included a link to Pierre Trudeau's speech on multiculturalism on Blackboard. And there are certainly a number of scholars in Canada who have considered multiculturalism and the limitations of this discourse. You'll see later on in the text and in the slide deck that we look at some of these critiques. Some people argue that multiculturalism is a positive policy, or a policy that brings positive benefits to people in Canadian society, because it allows for people to retain their own cultural traditions, their own linguistics traditions, their own way of being and doing. It allows us to develop an ethnically and culturally and racially diverse society. And it suggests that this idea of diversity as a positive, as a benefit to society, is something that we can create or embrace as a Canadian value. However, many people argue that this is not true, and that there are many limitations to the policy and practice of multiculturalism in Canada. But we'll look at that material a little bit later in the slide deck. Immigration is important to Canadian society. At the present time, immigration is an important element in maintaining and increasing the Canadian population. Some people refer to Canada as a white settler society. It's not one of my favorite discourses, and I'd prefer to have conversations about diasporic communities, or communities of diaspora, because I don't think everyone always comes to Canada voluntarily. However, that being said, we need to talk a little bit about history. The early immigrants in Canadian society were European. Most of them, if not all of them, were white, and most of them came from English-speaking European countries. Later on, the inclusion of immigrants whose first language wasn't English, and I should have said English and French, were allowed to enter Canada, predominantly because Canadians needed particular skilled tradespeople in order to be able to meet the demand for things like housing. So we allowed immigrants from places like Portugal, Italy, Spain, and other European countries in order to meet those needs. In the early days of Canadian immigration, there were many myths about people of color which prevented them from being able to come to Canada. For example, people from hot climates were believed to be unsuitable to live in Canada because of our cold winters. But things have changed, and certainly we see a different pattern of immigration, with large numbers of people from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean entering into Canada. So as I mentioned, early policies on immigration related to a desire by the state to populate the country and to develop particular industries, particular sectors, and particular economic activities. And as a result, we needed workers who were skilled in particular kinds of activities. So some people argue that things have changed a lot, and that goodwill or multiculturalism is a part of Canada's policy on immigration. But I think if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see that economic factors still play a very significant role in the Canadian immigration policy system. We still want particular kinds of workers. We want workers, or we want people who come with large economic bases who are interested in business. We want people who can afford to contribute to the Canadian economy, who will bring capital from their own home country to the Canadian economic system. Many people argue that the policies of immigration, past and present, are explicitly racist, and that the policies are really more about controlling who gets in than they are about creating a welcoming environment for people who are entering Canada. Throughout the history of Canadian immigration, the Canadian government has implemented policies to restrict particular people from having access to immigration to Canada. Sometimes these policies are explicit, and sometimes they're implied. It's more complicated to figure out what it is that the Canadian government is trying to do when they implement a particular policy. So, for example, we might understand the Chinese head tax as a very distinct, very specific rule or piece of a policy that would restrict or limit the capacity of Chinese people to enter into Canada. But policies like the continuous journey requirement, another example Hick provides us with, are they're a bit more tricky. We have to think about who it is that is affected by this particular policy and how it's been designed to limit or restrict particular populations, particular groups of people from entering Canada without necessarily labeling or identifying those groups. We know that after the Second World War, the need for workers changed the way in which the Canadian government looked at immigration. It also focused more on particular kinds of skills as it allowed people to enter into the country. Hick describes this as a right kind model of immigration. The point system can be understood as a second iteration of this kind of immigration policy. Here, people who were applying to immigrate were assigned particular points based on particular personal characteristics and credentials that they would bring with them to the immigration process. People with more education, for example, or more language skills, or more economic resources to bring with them, might score higher than someone with less education, fewer linguistic skills, and fewer economic resources. In some ways, there's a class element to this process of administering a point system, as it supports people who have more access to resources in order to create for themselves the package of skills, abilities, and resources that they would need to be seen or looked favorably upon by the immigration system. Some of the immigration policy included in the Canadian immigration system does support the immigration of family members, and sponsorship programs have been set up to allow people who have family members living in another country to provide supports to these people so that they too can immigrate. Refugee class immigrants are immigrants who are admitted on a compassionate basis, who are seeking protection from particular forms of persecution, oppression, or violence that are recognized by the Canadian state. We're returning for a few minutes back to this idea of multicultural policy, a policy that was designed to provide resources and supports to assist people to participate fully in Canadian society and to make Canadian society a more welcoming place. The idea was the promotion of cultural exchanges and also support for people obtaining language skills in French and or English. The idea behind multiculturalism was a kind of cultural exchange or a sharing where people who did not share a common culture or ethnicity could develop a more complex understanding of one another through opportunities to connect and mingle and showcase who they were and what they knew. What is problematic about this understanding is that some scholars have argued it assumes people know nothing about another culture, and it doesn't acknowledge the fact that many people bring with them biases or particular myths or stereotypes about particular cultures, and that any process of cultural exchange requires an unlearning of these. But there are few resources or supports to support that kind of unlearning, so a more holistic cultural exchange process can take place. To get to the specifics of some of the critiques of multiculturalism, there are a lot of people who argue the goals of multiculturalism, while ideal, are not a very realistic expectation. Multiculturalism is described by scholars like Shireen Razak as a perspective that assumes people know nothing about other cultures. This knowing nothing means that people are absolutely open to the idea of learning about another culture. But in reality, people bring biases, stereotypes, assumptions, and histories with them to any interchange that's aimed at multiculturalism. And so, part of the process of multiculturalism means unlearning these old pieces of knowledge, many of which are faulty, in order to learn new kinds of ways and new understandings about the people involved in the multicultural exchange. But the Canadian government hasn't, and didn't in the past, invest the kinds of resources that would be necessary to engage in this kind of educational process. Instead, multiculturalism is described by scholars like George Day, who is a scholar on critical race theory, as sorry samosas and steel band syndrome. Now, I've also heard this quote associated with Shireen Razak as sorry samosas and not much else. So I guess perhaps they quote one another, or there are multiple sources for this kind of conversation. And really, multiculturalism was committed to the easy parts of culture: singing, dancing, food, celebrations. And these are not necessarily the challenging things, like, for example, conflicts of values or nuanced understandings that exist within the daily practices of a culture. Some people argue that multiculturalism as a Canadian identity or as a part of Canadian culture, in a way, becomes a kind of absence of culture. Some people argue that multiculturalism contributes to a kind of destabilization in Canadian identity, and that this could lead to threats to the cohesiveness of Canada, and that this perhaps amplifies the conflicts that exist between English Canada and French Canada. Some people argue, as Hick has shown us, that the process of multiculturalism in creating an understanding of diversity creates a homogenization of difference and a homogenization of race. You'll have to decide whether it's a policy that you believe in or if it's something that you want to commit your time to in terms of practice. It's controversial. It probably brings with it some possibilities, some opportunities, but it also brings with it some challenges and some threats. What multiculturalism doesn't do is provide practical assistance for new immigrants in the challenges that they face when they come to Canada. Learning a new language might be a challenge, but learning to negotiate the system in order to access resources and the multiple systems that someone might have to deal with can be an even greater challenge. How exactly do you get a health card? Do you know? Do you know how you get a health card if you're a new Canadian? What if you move to another province? Well, if you haven't experienced that phenomena, you might have no idea. What about accessing school, finding out about language education, or finding housing? There are many challenges that face immigrants when they come to Canada, and racism, exclusion, discrimination, oppression, and isolation further complicate these difficult situations. Employment is another area where newcomers face challenges. There is a high level of unemployment among newcomers. For newcomers who are able to find a job, there is significant levels of underemployment. We sometimes joke about the cab driver who has a PhD, but there is a grain of truth in this mythological story. It speaks to the idea that in one's home country, a person might have highly valued skills or high levels of education. But in Canada, skills, knowledge, and education may not be recognized, which may require workers or people, new immigrants, to take jobs that are far below their capability. For people who may be able to have their credentials recognized, let's say, for example, a social worker who moves from one country to another, there is a need to pay fees, to have credentials assessed, and to have education assessed in order to be recognized in a Canadian context. And this all costs money. Furthermore, recognition of experience in a home country may not resonate with Canadian employers who may have an expectation of someone having Canadian experience. This means that many newcomers experience low levels of income and therefore are vulnerable to experiencing poverty. Racism or xenophobia, which is the fear of difference, may further complicate a newcomer's experiences of seeking employment. Some immigrants may need to develop some particular skills in order to improve their chances of getting a job. For example, someone might need to reformat their resume or present their cover letter in a way that's more consistent with Canadian traditions of employment applications. Some people may need to enhance their skills, particularly if there is a technical language relevant to the kind of employment they're hoping to get. Ways of dressing for an interview or presenting yourself in an interview may also differ from place to place, and so developing these skills in this area may help newcomers be more successful at the job search. But there are many scholars, including the work of Roxana Eng and the work of Kieran Merchandani, which suggest that there may be a little bit too much emphasis on this idea of the need to develop skills, and that in a globalized world, there's a lot of overlap from place to place about how one presents oneself for work. That being said, we know that when people are applying for work, whether they are newcomers or people who have lived and worked in Canada for many years, there are particular biases. For example, biases that relate to age and gender. And these realities may present themselves within the employment seeking context for newcomer groups and individuals as well. I kind of like this slide because I think it kind of outlines the fact that there really are biases that relate to the experience of seeking work when you're a newcomer. How those biases play out, how they're presented in individual circumstances may differ, but these themes of racism that is both subtle and overt, and culturally biased hiring practices definitely play a factor in the higher levels of unemployment and underemployment experienced by newcomers. Beyond racism as an explanation for underemployment and unemployment among new immigrants, theoretical perspectives, like the ones we've been looking at throughout the course, can be applied to the study of unemployment and underemployment among newcomers. We could look at it from a labor market approach, which would suggest that people are experiencing unemployment or are living in the context of underemployment because those are the jobs that are available, and the market should determine the level of employment and the areas of employment that are open to all people, and newcomers are no exception to this rule. The human capital perspective emphasizes skills, suggesting that newcomers who want to gain better employment should gain diverse and easily transferable skills in order to enhance their capacity to experience success in seeking employment. Drawing again on the idea that racism and xenophobia are significant in the experiences of underemployment and unemployment faced by newcomers, the anti-racist approach looks at how racism shapes experiences in employment. It also looks at rights discourses and how these discourses may be helpful in changing our policy and our perspective on unemployment, and on employment processes in order to enhance the capacity of newcomers to access work within the sector. It sees employment and employment processes as linked to privilege, which we might read as white privilege. An anti-racist approach looks at who benefits from the social arrangements as they exist. So, we might say that white privilege in this circumstance allows for the privilege of employing white people to continue, placing people of color at a disadvantage. Changes to the immigration policy put in place by the Conservative government have made immigration more difficult overall. It has reduced the number of supports and resources available to newcomers. It has set very specific criteria and very specific curriculum in the area of English language education. And it has complicated the citizenship process, making the system more difficult to negotiate and the process of obtaining citizenship more difficult. There is a lot of competition to become a Canadian immigrant, and the fees and charges or surcharges that are charged to people applying to Canada is a significant source of revenue for the federal government. That concludes our digital video lecture. Thanks very much for listening and watching. And the next chapter, because we're not exactly going in order at this point in time, will be ready for you shortly. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you at that point in time.